Uh, when the settlers came to Rolette County in the 1880s, I doubt that they were fully aware of the cloud that was over the land that they were taking as homestead. And we have learned a great deal about that in recent weeks. And today, to give us a real background on that, is one of the most distinguished, knowledgeable people in the area. And before I get further, I'd like to have Les LaFountain introduce John Shaw to you. Les himself is very distinguished in this area. As many of you know, Les met with us a couple of times, and he is a noted Ojibwe historian in the Turtle Mountains and serves on the staff of the Turtle Mountain Community College. So go ahead, Les, and introduce our speaker today.
Well, it's a real honor to introduce John Shaw to you all. It's the first time I've actually met John in person via video online communication here, so it's interesting. But John and I have been visiting on the through email mostly over the last I don't know, 10 years it seems like, I think. But John grew up over in the area of New Jersey along the Delaware River, which is interesting because the word Delaware, it refers to the Lenni Lenape tribe, which are Anishinaabe speakers, which Turtle Mountain is Anishinaabe people. And so John grew up there, I think was inspired by that history, of course, of his parents bringing him to reenactments of George Washington's conflicts there along that river during the American Revolution. And then John went on to get a master's degree in American Indian Studies and then a doctorate degree by the research he did on the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. And it was an occurrence that I came across his dissertation and was mesmerized by it. And I immediately went to the sources because I had saw information there that I'd never seen before. And I've been studying our history for a long time. And so I read all the footnotes because I was fascinated by the source where he got his information. So I think you all are, and myself included, are in for a real interesting presentation by John Shaw. John currently teaches at Portland Community College, and as Paul mentioned, I also teach at the Turtle Mountain Community College. So that's my introduction. I may have to zoom out here for a little bit because I have some things going on, but I will definitely watch this in full because I don't want to miss anything John says. So guys, welcome John to our presentation here.
Great. Thank you so much, Les. You're more than kind. Thank you. Okay. In the interest of time, I'll just sort of launch into this since I've been introduced and Paul sent out my bio and you know who I am in the book or the dissertation or something else like that. So I don't think there's any need for any more introductory information. If anybody wants to know more about me or something, could do the Q&A, I guess, at the end. So when Paul asked me to do this, I asked him, shout out to Les. I watched his presentation and before, and he did the heavy lifting, the hard work of trying to explain federal Indian law and policy in, I don't know, 45 minutes, and did yeoman's work, and also found out how it's virtually impossible to take so many complex subjects that seem so foreign to most of our understandings about how law and our justice system is supposed to work. So I'm not going to go back over any of that stuff either. But it might come up. So I asked Paul, so give me some specific things that the group might be interested in. And so here they are. So why the government was interested in the land of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, the steps they took to gain control of it, the resistance from the Native communities. I was saying to a few people before we got started here, that's basically the trajectory of the book. It's just that's all it is. They're basically struggling. When it's subtitle legal struggle, the legal struggle is basically they're trying to hold on to their land, resisting all of the entreaties and intrusions of non-native entities, whether they're governmental or private or individual. Efforts from both sides of compromise, which I thought would be Paul thought would be an interesting topic. I'll have some of those. There's not a lot, or I think most of you might already guess about who was willing to compromise and who wasn't. And then the end results. That's a fairly tangible thing, and there's no happy endings here, but at least some very, very, very belated restorative justice just made its way through the U.S. legal system within the past year. So that's where I'll end up. And Paul's other question was here, many of the attendees might be wondering whether their pioneer ancestors were homesteading on land that was agreed to be the public domain, or whether they were illegally squatting on Ojibwe land. I'll leave that question open. I think everyone will be able to answer it accurately by the time we get finished. So just to start here, a little framing, a few sort of famous quotes or something. Okay, you know, the mindset of the time period we're talking about here, basically 1865 to 1905. But here's a quote from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1879. Sort of, I think, encapsulates the attitude, the shifting attitude that the federal Indian bureaucracy had towards Native people in general. This isn't necessarily directed towards the Turtle Mountain Band in particular. So 1879, there have been many, many, many reservations created since the 1850s and many conflicts. But here's his summary. There's hardly a reservation within the limits of the United States which has not been subjected to European American encroachments. So this was a common thing, even though there were all this treaty language. Les is familiar with this about how the U.S. government would act as a trustee, right? As a guardian, right? That they would actually protect Native communities within the boundaries of the reservations. But those promises were rarely, if ever, kept. He goes on to say, they resort to all kinds of devices and schemes to gain a foothold on Indian soil and offer ready and varied excuses for their continued unlawful occupancy. So, you know, that's the situation that we will encounter throughout this presentation. Here's a sort of an interesting sort of counter quote. I thought bringing it up to present day, but this is from President Obama back in 2009, right? Part of my effort here in researching the story and presenting it was to try to include what's known in the genre as the Native voice. You know, there's plenty of non-Native peoples writing, members of Congress, the government, the bureaucracy, at the state level, at the local level, in the media, the newspapers of the day and stuff like that. And, you know, one can go to them and find them, and they're definitely part of the story, right? The part of the story that gets left out, usually, that I wanted to push more to the forefront was, well, what did the Turtle Mountain Band say for themselves? I mean, what was their thoughts throughout this? So Obama's quote is, history has shown that a failure to include the voices of tribal officials in formulating policy affecting their communities has all too often led to undesirable and at times devastating and tragic results. So that's sort of a little where we're starting with all these things. Quick little map here, which is in my book. Don't have time to explain what it all means. The trajectory of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Chippewa people, but for our purposes, of course, here, right? It's the left-hand green arrow, right? The one that points right here to where we're talking about today, Turtle Mountain. So it was a long migration that their origin stories talk about, right? But it was a major shift, right, for a band to basically abandon the Great Lakes, the Eastern Woodlands culture that they had originated in, right, and venture out to become a sort of a plains tribe out on the northern plains. Now, just one concept, federal Indian law and policy concept. I'm sure Les mentioned it, but I just thought if I had to reiterate one, I should reiterate this one. It's just referred to as Indian title or Aboriginal Indian title, right? And it basically talks about the idea, of course, you know, Native communities, 500 plus nations all over North America, long before there were any colonial European governments in North America, right? So clearly they knew that there were people who were living here, inhabiting in here. There was propaganda, of course, that too much of the country was vacant or unoccupied, which was exaggerated, which was never really true, right? But they had to acknowledge that they had some possessory right of the land that they lived on. This is a quote from a famous Supreme Court decision in 1835. So long before our story starts here. And I wanted to quote it because when we're talking about the Supreme Court, as you all know, right, we're talking about basically the highest law of the land. This is the final say. Of course, what is said in court decisions isn't always abided by, even at that level. So, but here's one from this case called Mitchell versus the United States. Their hunting grounds were as much in their actual possession as the cleared fields of the whites, and their rights to its exclusive enjoyment in their own way and for their own purposes. Indian right of occupancy is considered as sacred as the fee simple of the whites. That sounds good. Of course, what I'm saying next is despite that, right? Yeah, that's not the way things worked out. So what Indian title refers to, the concept refers to, is this acknowledgement by the federal government that tribes have a possessory interest to use and occupy land. Notice I didn't use the word own. Right? The part of the thing that's disquieting for Native communities, of course, is that the European sovereigns, whether it was Great Britain or the United States, right, asserted their superior sovereignty, right, and claimed that their sovereignty basically owned all the land, right? But recognizing that it was inhabited before they got here, right? Acknowledging Native communities have a right to occupy land and to use land. The other thing is then to obtain their land in a legal manner, right? The right of Indian title has to be extinguished, is a common term used, or ceded here, right, with a C-E-D-E-D, or you'll see the word cession with a C-E-S-S-I-O-N, right? By a legal settlement or an agreement, right? Here, generally, we're talking about a treaty, right? With a European colony or successor state. So that's the way it's supposed to work out. Indians have some possessory occupation right to their land, right? And there's supposed to be a legal mechanism for that land to be shifted from their occupation and use to non-native occupation and use. Establishing Indian title, you know, is that they had to. This is what's known in law is as an established fact, right? It's a fact of law. The tribes had to demonstrate or prove that they inhabited a definable territory, right? That was exclusively theirs, right? To distinguish from other tribes, right? And they had to be recognized as having some semblance of self-government. In other words, they were self-governing and they could sit down and negotiate a treaty or an agreement as a sovereign entity, right, with their fellow sovereign, which would be the federal government. So that's the concept of Indian title. That's the only sort of background I think anyone needs for the rest of this. In terms of the land, and I'm glad that Paul had asked me for a document, a 15-page document that he posted for this discussion group today. I think it was from 1876 or 1872, one of the earlier declarations by the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa about exactly how they defined their own homeland, you know, the actual geographic boundaries that they considered their homeland. And the interesting thing in researching this is how far back it went, right? And it really started in terms of a first sort of tangential relationship with the federal government starts back in 1825. The federal government was basically trying to identify and all the sort of Northern Plains tribes, who was allied with whom, who they felt they could deal with from various communities at that time. The Turtle Mountain Band were not involved in that negotiation or anything else like that. Okay. But what they were involved with is that the Chippewa that attended this larger Northern Plains, Northern Great Lakes treaty in Prairie du Chien in 1825, there was a sidebar treaty. And this is very interesting because we always think of treaties in terms of American Indian history as, okay, the Indians make a tribe makes a treaty with the government, right? To be honest with you, I'm sure it's not the only one, right? But you don't, and Les could correct me if and I probably am wrong, is that you don't find many treaties between tribes, right? So this is one, it's known as the Sweet Corn Treaty. It's named after one of the sort of English translations of one of the Dakota negotiators at this. And at that time, the Dakota representatives wanted to meet with the Chippewa representatives and sort of define boundaries between themselves outside of what the federal government thought that they should or eventually would be. Right. So again, you're going to see this over and over again. We're not going to belabor every little geographic point. No, I don't know if anyone other than the participants at that 1825 sidebar knew about this. Was not documented. It was not written down. Right. This was a verbal agreement between the two groups, the Chippewa and the Dakota. Right. But it comes up again, right, when now the federal government is getting involved in sort of creating boundary lines and reservations for both of these groups, right? And so in 1858, While the Dakota mentioned to some of the US negotiators, they bring up the Sweet Corn Treaty, right? And they provide an interpreter or whatever to basically write down what was agreed upon back in 1825. And so for our purposes here today, the interesting point is where they are saying their definable exclusive homeland is. And so again, it says, you know, ascending the course of the Goose River up to its source, then taking due westerly course and passing through the center of Devil's Lake at Poplar Grove. After it leaves the lake, continuing west to Maison du Chien, which was the French, but Dog Den Butte. It's probably the more common non-French name it's used. From thence, taking a northwesterly direction to its terminus point near the Missouri River, within gunshot sound of the Little Knife River. So this was finally written down in 1858 and became part of a U.S. Department of Interior report in 1872. So I just point this out to you as it basically is, okay, so what is the Indian title of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa? That is basically it. Just a few reference maps. Well, some of you are joining us today from North Dakota. Some of us are not. So you've seen maps like this. This was one that was an image that's in the book and it was in my dissertation. It just shows tribal locations in 1850. But again, this area here, basically we just talked about, is just labeled Plains Chippewa. Right? But that is the Turtle Mountain and the Pembina Band of Chippewa. They don't exactly draw the boundaries here, but you can see that the Dakota are down here below the Cheyenne River. There's also here, this is the Little Knife River here, and here's where it joins the Missouri. So they don't show the Goose River here, which is a little north of the Cheyenne River, but so it's basically sort of going to run across here like this, right? And then up to ultimately to the 49th parallel at that time. So that's one map that gives you a general view, and of course acknowledges the other tribal groups in North Dakota as well. This one is also in the book, and I found this in the archives in Washington, D.C., and similar to the file that Paul posted for you for our discussion today. This is another memorial that the tribe made here, and it was accompanied by this drawing. It's very hard to read, and I know you can't really see it here as well. It doesn't really show the Knife River. They've got the caption in here. They've sort of cut it off, but again, you can see the Red River, the Goose River, sort of cutting over here to some point near the Little Knife River juncture with the Missouri, and then up north. This makes it probably look a little bit bigger than the claim that was made before. So, but again, it gives you a general overview. Of course, it also shows the two reservations as well. But this memorial was entered into a government document in 1876. And again, you can see that how consistent they are in different, by this time, now we're talking about Little Shell 3 being the tribal chief. So he's, many predecessors, right? But what amazed me in doing the research is how consistent the band was as to exactly what their territory entailed. Right? And the frustrating part is time after time after time, this isn't all like the Native peoples are always right and the government's always wrong. right? There were many people in the federal government in various levels, whether it was Congress or they were judges or they were in the BIA or something like that, right? Who acknowledged, right, and supported the claims of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa sort of over and over and over again. It's just that when it seemed like time after time after time, from about 1865 to let's say 1892, when the infamous Macomber agreement, which we'll get to, was imposed on them to make a final settlement, right, is that there were many, many, many close calls, right, where an adequate amount of the original, and the estimate is that we're talking about 10 million acres, right? So sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 9.5, sometimes it's 8.5, depending what's happened. Let's just use 10 as the beginning size of the Turtle Mountain Band's territory. To claim a section of it, maybe 500,000 acres, cede the other 9.5 million or 8 million, depending what had already been given away. But if you go through the book or the dissertation, you'll see every time they sort of get close to achieving that goal, right, somebody objects, right, and it throws the whole thing off, right, and it's sort of then deja vu all over again. I mention it, I try to express it, they express it themselves, hence the native voice. I don't know, I'm not speaking, so I try to let the historical record that I found, using all the footnotes that Les loves, right, know that I'm quoting the actual people here. I'm not just sort of making things up. But again, here's the part in the dark here, like it's pretty much the same thing. The consistency in identifying their homeland. Paul had cited originally when he contacted me the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which I'm not going to go back to and explain. I think you all know probably. This was a piece of legislation passed under the Articles of Confederation before we ratified our Constitution, that talked about basically how new areas of the United States would be incorporated into territories, right? And territories, how they would be governed temporarily, as a small number of European Americans made their way out there. And then there'd be a stage where they would sort of be partial federal government, partial territorial. And then when finally, I think it was 60,000 people showed up, they could apply to Congress for statehood, and they would meet certain criteria, and they would be admitted to the Union on an equal footing, right? Every state that comes into the United States, whether it's number 1 Delaware or number 50 Hawaii, right? They're all equal in the eyes of the law and the federal government. The particular thing, though, that we're interested here was what's known as the utmost good faith clause, right? Again, this is going to sound like the quote I gave from the 1835 Supreme Court decision, right? This is the ideal. This is the way things were supposed to work, right? This is what the federal government said. We're just a few years after attaining our independence, right? The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed. It's hard to follow up and make a witty comment about that, but I think this was the way we wish it had all turned out, right? And I think we would all be a lot better off if it had. Of course, we know this is not the way it occurred. The other thing I'll just show you here, there's another piece of it that talked about how land, once Indian titles is extinguished and land is ceded, under the general land office, and then is surveyed and then is sold, right? The whole grid system, this whole thing about townships and acres and stuff, it was all defined in this early piece of legislation in 1785 and 1787. So later on, and you all know this, it talked about, Turtle Mountain reservation being 2 townships, right? You get the side of what a township is, or what a section is, what a quarter section is, what a half section is, what the whole thing. So it all derives from this legislation. So I thought it might be important just to point. Okay, moving along. Why was the U.S. government interested in land claimed by the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, right? So again, I'm not going to have time to go into all these things, but I do lay these out and try to provide a little substance to each of these things. I was talking to Michael at the beginning here before we started. He was talking about how demographic changes in Norway's we're pushing those people out, right? I mean, a lot of history is explained by push factors and pull factors, right? What are the negative things that push any group of people at any point in history out of where they start from, right? And it's usually, well, lack of land, lack of resources, war, all kinds of things like that. And then the pull factors are, of course, what attracts you to go to a new area. It's sort of the polar opposite. So when in rereading my book, since it was published, my editor should have told me that I was only allowed to use the term demographic deluge a limited number of times and not to keep saying it over and over and over again. So if I ever rewrite this thing, I will try to just change it. Right? But that's one thing. I mean, you can't ignore it. It's just, the European American population is so huge and putting so much pressure, and the native population is so relatively small and dwindling. That is a big part of the dynamics of European American, Native American history. Go back to wherever you want to go back, right? If you want to go back to New Mexico in the 17th century, or if you want to start with Plymouth in 1620 or something like that. So just mentioning here, I had some details before about North Dakota. I mean, 8 new states were created between 1865 and 1890. So that just shows you what was going on. Urbanization is a larger phenomenon in the country, largely spurred also by immigration, also the second industrial revolution, right? All these things are interconnected. I'm sure you can see and realize that, right? So many immigrants are pouring into the major cities, and then many then leave that. But the cities just become, markets for resources, right? I mean, food has to be provided, clothing, jobs, right? So that's going to mean is that the opening of the Trans-Mississippi West, right, becomes the area, right, to extract resources, right, that are needed by the burgeoning populations, mostly east of the Mississippi as well. So I'm not talking about urbanization in North Dakota or at Turtle Mountain by any stretch of the imagination. I'm talking about it as a national phenomenon, as well as the deluge of immigration in this time period.
Hey, John, it's 37 minutes after the hour. I know you're not going to finish in 45, and let's say we shoot for finishing at the top of the hour. That's still just 20 minutes. So if you can talk about that.
Okay, good, thanks. The second industrial revolution, just to mention here, part of the story is the decline of the bison or the buffalo on the northern plains, right? Which the Turtle Mountain Band hunted, with their Métis relatives and allies. a lot of people like, oh, so the buffalo hides, and they hear about, oh, railroads needed the meat to eat, companies to feed the workers and stuff like that. In an era before synthesized rubber and chemicals and stuff like that, it was buffalo hides that provided the machine belts that drove the second industrial revolution in the late 19th. Overland trails is not really big up here. Cattle drives, mining areas, that's a factor here. Stagecoaches and of course railroads, right? So for our purposes here, certainly the demographic deluge and the railroads are important reasons why the federal government wanted the land. So the idea of the government during this time period, reservation policy, is to separate, isolate, and concentrate Native peoples on as small and marginal grants of land as possible, right? And of course, then the idea is the cession would lead to the sale of the excess lands to ranchers, homesteaders, miners, lumbermen, and they would be the ones, right, who would be protected, right, by the U.S. To U.S. Army, right. That's part of what's going on with the general policy of this time period. So after the Old Crossing Treaty, which I wasn't going to reiterate because I think that's sort of a discrete thing, we're talking about the period after it, again, where the Red Lake Band and the Pembina Band signed the treaty with the United States in 1863, or where they did cede, right, this portion of land west of the Red River, right? And so that was fine with the Turtle Mountain Band, right? They were parties to that treaty because they knew they had their 10 million acres, right, west of that treaty cession land. The Homestead Act, right? I think Michael and I mentioned this briefly, right? So this idea that the demographic deluge is also accompanied by a pent-up demand for almost free land, right? Everybody knows there's no such thing as free land, like free lunch, right? But it was pretty reasonable if you paid the fees and follow a few simple rules. So obviously, that was a huge impetus for people moving out there. Just a map here of North Dakota in 1889. You can see how divided up it is. I like this map because at least they did outline here Turtle Mountain for reference. The forts, right? The U.S. Army built a series of forts in North Dakota, right? Again, they were to keep the Native people in check, no question about it. And they were there generally to protect the non-Native interests, even though they were supposed to be fair arbiters of that as well. So they're complaining, the Turtle Mountain people are very early on are complaining about the intrusion here, especially Fort Totten, right? Fort Totten, and eventually, Les mentioned in his presentation, Fort Berthold, right? So immediately they take 500,000 acres for Fort Totten right away, right? Create a reservation there, and a large, excellent source of timber that had traditionally been utilized by them, and they chased the Turtle Mountain people out of being able to access timber on this thing. So the land is taken. It's not done by treaty or agreement. They just take it. It's unceded land. The United States government occupies it illegally, and they let other people encroach on that land as well. The railroads, a huge thing as well, right? So you see here, at least this shows the Great Northern, which was the main one that affected where we're talking about today. But after the Civil War, right, there was this big push to link the Trans-Mississippi West, right? The gold rush and all the stuff out had already happened in the 1840s, 1850s on the West Coast. There wasn't much infilling here. They wanted to connect the Mississippi with the Pacific and ports like Seattle, San Francisco, LA, San Diego as well. So railroads were a big factor in prying open Turtle Mountain territory. Again, these railroads were just built, right? They were not negotiated for. The Turtle Mountain Band wasn't given an opportunity to cede. The federal government just gave millions of acres of land to private railroad companies. Today, we might call it corporate welfare if we wanted to be uncharitable, right? And also funded them with huge subsidies, right? So the railroads were able to basically make a killing and these things. So that's why they're so aggressive. They're so eager to lay their tracks, to get their things established, to found new town sites, right? I mentioned down here, right? Rolla, Dunseth, St. John, Bottineau, right? These are all railroad towns, the Great Northern Railway. So there's a lot of illegal taking of land going on. Just to show, you've seen maps like this before, but since those towns were mentioned, right? Rolette and Dunseth and St. John and Rolla right there. You can just see how they are there, where the major highways are today. One less mention, so I'm not going to mention again in the interest of time. In 1871, the federal government tried to basically wash its hands of treaty making, you know, while the Turtle Mountain Bay people are basically saying, hey, we want a land cession treaty, right? We would like to settle our affairs here. Right? But this signaled a shift in attitude, right? Instead of just sort of treating Native nations as semi-sovereign entities, they were now being denigrated or looked down upon as the term was wards of the nation, wards of the federal government. In other words, people who were not capable of determining their own affairs, of controlling their own destiny, right? So that sort of was just an unfortunate timing. As Les also mentioned, even though they stopped making treaties, they still made agreements. And the Macomber Agreement in 1892, the one derided accurately as the 10-cent treaty by the Turtle Mountain Band, was imposed in 1892. But it just shows you that the attitude that's going on, which is sort of the Commission of Indian Affairs, 1872. No one will rejoice more heartily than the present commissioner when the Indians of this country cease to be in a position to dictate, right, as if they're dictating, in any form or degree to the government. If they stand up against the progress of civilization, progress of industry, they must be relentlessly crushed. The westward course of population, that's the European American population, is neither to be denied or delayed for the sake of all the Indians that ever called this their home. So the government feels that they can just force things, and that's basically what they do. They never really sit down and negotiate. The last of these factors specific to North Dakota, and you all would know about this, so I won't really talk about it, but there was the wheat boom, right? The bonanza farms in North Dakota, in industrial bonanza farming on some of the richest wheatlands in North America. And this map here was good. You can't really see the details, but you see this dark black area here. You can recognize where North Dakota is. You can see, yeah, I recognize that swath of land. That sort of coincides with some other swaths of land we're talking about. So, efforts to gain the foothold on taking control, the resistance, the efforts of compromise. I think again they all sort of roll into one thing. But in addition to wanting to listen to the Native voice, I would also wanted to show that basically not talk about tribal sovereignty in some sort of abstract legalistic manner, right? But I wanted to demonstrate tribal sovereignty in action, what did the tribe actually do, right, to determine their own future. And, you know, my finding was, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, their persistence, never giving up is just, you know, amazing. So, again, in terms of resistance, right, the one objective of their tribal attorney, John B. Boatno, right, we ask justice upon the merit of our claim. That's it. So you saw the claim from 1825, you know, reiterated in 1858, you know, acknowledged and recognized by all sorts of government officials, right? So there is no disagreement about the claim, right? But there's always somebody who raises an objection for some reason before they can ever negotiate or settle anything. A large part of which, again, less talked in about, so I won't just mention it this once. Part of their resistance was removal. That was the government's first offer, basically. They were hoping that the whole band could be removed to the reservation, the Ojibwe reservation in White Earth, Minnesota. Right? And so it wasn't, they didn't just bring this up one time. They keep bringing it up throughout these 20, 30 years of the 19th century. So a big part of the Turtle Mountain resistance is resistance to removal. As Les said, yes, a few people went, you know, they tried to bribe them by saying they could only get their annuities, their annual annuities from the old crossing treaty. They'd only pay them out at White Earth, you know, making them travel a couple hundred miles each way to go get their annuity. They didn't fall for any of that. They were not going to remove themselves. The other thing is delegations. They sent delegation, and Les probably knows, I think he might have stepped out too. I don't know the exact number of delegations, and I felt as I was doing this, and I was remiss. I should have tallied them all up and come up with an accurate number. But from the early 1870s to the early 1890s, or into the 1890s, they send many delegations to Washington, D.C. To negotiate a fair land cession treaty. So this is just a picture from the book. There's Little Shell 3 there. These gentlemen are his company with him there as well. These are a couple of officials there as well. It was a big thing for the U.S. government to photograph, which we're great, which Les and I and everyone else are grateful for, to have these photos, you know, belonging in the National Archives or the Smithsonian Institute. Memorials to Congress was another big thing. There's so much written documentation, which my book cites times. The Turtle Mountain Band were not only blessed with a consistent lineage of chiefs, Little Shell 1, Little Shell 2, Little Shell 3, right? And other the tribal council, the sub chiefs, right? But they also had a great tribal attorney, and as far as I know, I don't know of any other American Indian tribe who had their own tribal member attorney in the 19th century. There might be somebody. I don't think there is. So that was John B. Boatno. So Little Shell and his tribal council are writing memorials along with Boatno, you know, who's a little bit more obviously adept in English and French than they were. Boatno is also representing them in. There they are. A little bit later. In this picture, Little Shell's a little bit more worn. You can tell he's a little bit worn out or wear here, as well as Bowden. This is from 1896. The only photo they can show as well. But having a Boatno as both a lobbyist and a lawyer in Washington, D.C. Was a huge advantage for the Turtle Mountain Band. For naught, unfortunately, as well. So memorials, delegations, protests, and there's just all these documents as well again, saying that they would choose the reserve tract, not the U.S. government. That's my idea of tribal sovereignty in action. Complaining, what will become of us? Where will we seek a home? We are helpless to protect our own rights. As time goes by, they're becoming more and more frustrated for obvious reasons. They're also gotten pretty savvy about what's really going on here, right? Here there's boat notes saying, the government should be protecting our interest against designing men with selfish motives, right? All sorts of people are traveling out into Dakota territory, looking for, timberlands, looking to speculate on homestead claims, looking for mining areas like the lignite coal that was found a little bit as well. Meanwhile, Commissioner of Indian Affairs after Indian Affairs is acknowledging their claim, saying, yeah, boy, you've got as good a claim as any other tribal entity we've ever encountered. Unfortunately, didn't come to much. Here's my thing too, is that much credit should go to the various Chippewa and Métis chiefs, headmen, counselors, warriors, delegates, and their attorney, their solicitor, right, for creating a substantial public record on their behalf. I mean, that's what my book is. It is their public record, scattered through different archives, right? Finally, hopefully compiled in one place. All right. We're going to talk about treaties. So again, the 1880s, removal. In 1880s, things get a little dicey, right? They almost come to blows, sometimes with some settlers. Here's where some Canadians came down, right, and settled land that they didn't like on. Here's something Little Shell put this up. It is here forbidden for any white man to encroach upon this Indian land by settling on it before a treaty being made with the American government. So he did force them back over to Canada. Another interesting part here of the story is, right, really the US government does not want the Turtle Mountain Band at all, right? They won't remove to White Earth. The second alternative is they wish they would just go above the 49th parallel, right? Because they know with the sort of the Métis being maybe the majority of the band, the question comes up, are they really Indians? Are they really entitled to Indian title, right? Or are we just dealing here with a bunch of mixed breeds, the derogatory term, half breeds, those kind of things, right? Take them in a grain of salt, right? And so but the Canadian government was hoping they would stay below the 49th parallel, right? They were having enough trouble with the Métis up north of the border. The US government is saying they wish they would go up there as well. In fact, one of the pathetic arguments towards the end is that they can't grant the Turtle Mountain Chippewa any reservation because it's too close to the border. Well, that was not a newsflash, right? They had already granted the first executive order reservations, had granted the reservation that was located very close to the border. But then 10, 15 years later, even the reduced size of the reservation, you can't have that either because it's too close to the border. A border, of course, which they never recognized because traditionally, right, as bison hunters and everything else like that, with their Red River carts, right, the 49th parallel did not mean anything to them at all. So let me just get here to to make sure that just say the final Macomber Agreement in 1892 was imposed on the band, right? They were not given any choice. It was either sign and take the $1 million for the 10 million acres, or you get nothing. That was the final thing, right? They kicked Little Shell off the reservation. They banned Attorney Boatneau from the reservation, and they wouldn't deal with the tribal council, right? They created their own separate council known as the Council of 32, some hand-picked members of the tribe to negotiate, which they didn't really negotiate. They just sort of rubber stamped that.
So John, if you can send this copy to us and we'll pass it around to everybody, is that okay?
Sure. So
Okay.
here's the thing at the end here, just a couple of minutes, and I'll let people
Okay.
go and ask that question too. The end results, real quick. In 1946, the U.S. government created the Indian Claims Commission, right? No, realizing this is right after World War II, right, that there was a pile of grievances that had accumulated, right, over the previous maybe 100 years. And maybe it was time to address these issues once and for all. The mandate of the commission was not to give land back to Native peoples. They couldn't do that, but they could compensate them for their loss. Okay, and so that's essentially what happens. The Turtle Mountain Band presents their case to the Indian Claims Commission and about their Indian title, and the Indian Claims Commission rules in their favor, overwhelming. Here's the thing, found the consideration of the 10-cent treaty to be unconscionable. So then the thing was, okay, so it was unconscionable and you're going to compensate them. How are you going to compensate them? Again, no time for details, right? They had to determine, okay, what would have been the fair market value, right, of that land back there in 1892 when it was taken, right, by the Macomber Commission. So that's the number. Finally, now what would that be? This drags on through the 70s into the 80s, right? But they finally come up with an award in 1980, right? The money then sits in the Treasury. It is mismanaged. So then they sue, the Turtle Mountain Band sues the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Interior Department again for a just accounting of the money being held in the Treasury. And the final settlement ruled on in 2021 is that they are entitled to $59 million. It's the second largest award ever given by the federal government to any tribe in American history. And the tribal chairman at the time, Richard LaFombre, said it was a moral victory to a principle well taken by the Turtle Mountain Band for the distribution of something long waited for. So.
John, would you go back and tell us why you think they cut the reservation back from 20 townships to 2 townships, thereby opening up the land for most of the ancestors of people on this phone call today? That they would have not gotten it had it been 22 townships, but 20, but they cut it back to 2. Why did they cut it back?
I think they just wanted more land, and the way they did it, or the rationale they did it, is right. A big thing was they did a census of the tribe, right? Like, so how many members of the band are there, right? But instead of dealing with the tribal council, and Attorney Boatno was also the major genealogist for the band, right? He could trace his family and many families, you know, way back to basically like the 1790s as well. They wouldn't deal with him, so they brought in this agent who conducted basically a bogus census and said, "Oh, the 20 this is way too much land. These people don't need that too much. They'll be fine on 2 townships." So I mean that was the ruse. That was one ruse. The other one, back to the Indian title. The band members that existed, they weren't using their land properly. This is another always bugaboo that's always deployed by European against it, right? Oh, you have this land, but you're not using it properly. Or by properly, they meant productively in a capitalist sense, right?
What about coal on the Turtle Mountain Reservation?
Yeah, that was yes. There were mining interests there, and they tried to stop them, right? I mean, they complained about the timber being cut and them not being allowed to cut timber. Yeah, they complained about miners coming in. They complained about homesteaders basically pushing them off of their, they did try to get homesteads. They did try to get land in the public domain when they were pushed out of just the 2 townships, but they couldn't really do it at all. I don't have time, but I leave it in here. I have 2 specific cases of people tribal people litigating to get land. One was good. One was basically able to out legal lawyer a Welsh coal miner who claimed a homestead near the reservation, and the other one was the other side, where a guy lost his allotments and his thing and just gave up in disgust and sold his land back to the bank because he didn't have the resources to successfully litigate his land. His name was Joseph. So.
Time is short here. Please, if you have questions, ask questions. Don't give long talks or introductions. Just get to your question. Who's next? Who's next?
John, my question is about the BLM or Interior Department approving of the land grants, or land patents, issuing those, allowing claims on the land that hadn't yet been ceded.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just what happened. I mean, yeah, when the Secretary of Interior, Henry Teller, exactly reduces the reservation right from the 20 to the 2 townships, he just opens up the land and basically says, come on in. I mean, yeah, he has no legal basis to do it. So then he turns the land over to the general law land office, the GLO, right? And then the duty of the GLO is to survey, and that the map I showed of the grid pattern from the Northwest Ordinance, right, into the grid thing, and then the next thing is open it for sale. So they just went ahead and did it.
So
there's all this pressure to do it. Sorry.
Quite a bit of the land outside of Rolette County and, around surrounding areas around Rolette County were also involved with this, right?
Sure.
Jumping the gun and issuing land grants before they should have, because the land had not been ceded. True?
Yes. I found these couple maps, which are not in my book. I'll leave it in here. I don't have time to go, but at least it would, for some people, all of you, or some of you who know the more details about plots of land or where your family was or closeness or whatever. But this map here, the top one shows the original green 20 township reservation, the first executive order, and then the yellow one shows the second one. It doesn't show the third executive order, the final one, as well. And then this one, I thought this one was interesting because at least here it's now, I guess, a blow up here of Rolette County. I put the link in here where I just got it off the internet. But I'm not familiar with enough with the details to tell you about specific plots of land. But whoever, I mean, people. This is where we began the discussion with Michael just before we started. It's like, well, he asked me, well, how would anybody know that there was a countervailing? I was like, they wouldn't know. How would you know? There is not going to be some sort of public Turtle Mountain Band side of the story being readily available to the general European American public, right? As we talked about before, the local newspapers, the media, is extremely boosterish, is extremely anti-Indian, right? They don't want these people around here either. So you've got money behind economic interest, you've got population and pent-up demand, and again, the railroads, the Homestead Act. And so I don't blame any of the settlers. If the government says, hey, we surveyed the land and you can buy it, and they got legal title to the land, I don't think it's their fault. They shouldn't feel guilty or bad about it. It wasn't them who took the land literally. I'm guessing Les or whatever the rest of it have a slightly different view of that, I'm sure. But
Les, do you want to comment?
he might have dropped out.
You gotta unmute yourself, Les.
I muted the camera. I was trying to jump in there. It's tough with limited time, but I would say this, I mean, just like with issues happening today in history, we got to try to understand it in the same context, in my view. So, for example, the settlers, and even that term is kind of implies that the land was unsettled. So I'm a little uncomfortable using settlers, but we're so used to that because that implies that you're settling the land, and I'm saying the land was already settled. In fact, probably for thousands of years, we had an ecological relationship with the land in many ways. But here's the thing about the federal government. I was a state senator, and a lot of times people want to make the federal government a boogeyman, but I'll guarantee you there's not a governor in the United States that's not happy to take FEMA money when they have a crisis. So we demonize the federal government, and I think the federal system, which is an incredible system, it's amazing system. And sometimes when we get into this trashing, states versus federal government, or settlers taking land entirely, I don't take them off the hook. But I also, for my prior presentations, talked about people came to land for opportunity. It's just like the people coming across the border right now. They're coming here because their life is so awfully horrible, or they see an opportunity to have a better life. Is the same reason that the Europeans came 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's all the same. It's the same reason, and they came to take resources and land that Native people used. And so let me just say this as I wrap it up, Paul. In a democracy, we are the government at every level, whether it's state, local, federal. We got to be careful we don't demonize the government, because we are the government.
Very good. Thank you, Les. Chuck, do you have a question?
I've got a question here.
Go ahead. Go with it.
Just kind of a comment more. The township ranges and sections that became the Public Land Survey System, or PLSS as we call it, was actually started in 1785, not in 1787. 1787 was the first time it was used. So it wasn't started in 1787. It was actually initiated in 1785.
Right.
And then the other thing is,
I did mention that.
Oh, I didn't hear that part. I just heard that it started in 87.
There's actually two laws.
You have a question? Ask your question. Do you have a question?
Lump them into one.
Did you have a question, Joe?
Well, and then the other one was, did that lawyer pronounce his name different than the city of Bottineau?
I'm pronouncing it the way I pronounce it. So I'm not Alpha. I don't know the pronunciation. So is it Bottineau?
Oh, yeah, it's Bottineau.
Okay. See.
Other questions? Other questions?
I didn't know that, but thanks for telling me.
All righty.
Are there other questions? Chuck? Jeff? Further questions? In effect, is it accurate really to say, John, that the taking of the land by the homesteaders, they were taking land that was not ever placed in public domain, but they just got away with it, and then ended up with the national government paying $59 million for it. So when the homesteading occurred in the 1880s, they did not, this was not legal, and it was only made legal in effect after the fact, some in our today with the final payments. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, the government would argue, I think, is that the McCumber agreement is that now that was agreed upon.
Thank you. Arnie
So,
Estable, Arnie, is there one person from Norway?
Even though it was under duress, I tried to make it under duress by an entity that did not represent the tribe. And the rule was it was supposed to be a majority of the tribe had to, when that utmost good faith clause, the rule was a majority of the tribal members had to agree, had to consent to any sort of land cession deal. And they estimate there was only a quarter of the tribe was involved in that agreement.
Arnie Estable from Norway. Arnie, do you have a question?
What will happen if they find oil up there in the border of Turtle Mountain?
Is there oil up there? Is that your question?
Yeah. What will happen if there is big resources of oil?
Jeff Epping and Joe Martinetti are going to be speaking to us about the geology of Rolette County in an upcoming meeting. So they'll tell us about the presence of oil.
I'll preempt it, Paul, and say I wouldn't bet on oil being in Rolette.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that the suspicion that coal was widely available in the Turtle Mountain was a motivating factor for them cutting back from 20 townships to 2 townships because they didn't want the Indians to have the land where the coal was located. That's fascinating. Further questions? Richard, Dick, Coons?
Yeah, I have a question. Did the tribe actually get the $59 million settlement? And if they did, what did they do with it?
I'll let Les answer the second part. Yes, I mean, it is being, the funds are being paid out now as we speak. And there's 3 entities, right? There's, which I didn't mention, but there's the Turtle Mountain Band, there's the Pembina Band, and there's the Little Shell tribe, which out in Montana, which just got federal recognition a couple years ago. So there's three entities, and they are figuring out what the payment is going to, how it's going to proceed. I don't know the details.
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating, Dick, that here we had homesteaders in the 1880s and the payment is still not yet made?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, other questions, dear friends? Les, anything from you further?
Let me answer that question about the money. The Macomber Agreement was negotiated in 1892. It was like John's whole book is about that story. But there wasn't, the federal government paid out some of that money initially that was promised in those treaties. And then it wasn't until 1948 that our tribe filed a lawsuit where the federal government said, all right, tribes, and keep in mind, this is during a period that's pre-termination, where the United States government wanted to terminate tribes. So in the 1940s, they opened up this window, say, let's make those treaties that we negotiated with hundreds of years ago, in some cases, because we're talking about hundreds of tribes. They said, let's make it right and we'll pay that land up, or those claims. And so in 1940, we filed a lawsuit. I think it was approved somewhere around 1978, finally. So many generations of our people thought they were going to get that money and never did. So I'll just say kind of quickly, but in 1984, I was in college and I received a check for $43.85, and it was for land in the Red River Valley. So that was after 100 years. There's 2 different treaties there. There's the Old Crossing Treaty, which I talked about previously, and then John spent a lot of time talking about the Macomber Agreement. So we're talking about 2 different treaties there. But again, and I had no clue why I was getting $43. In fact, I want to tell you this story. I went and it piqued my curiosity about our history. And like, I didn't understand why I was getting this money, but I knew about this unpaid treaty from older people talking about it many generations. So we lived in abject poverty for all those years on some of the richest land in North Dakota, like the Red River Valley. So when I get this check, I started doing a little inquiry on it. And I thought, man, this is a story I don't ever want to forget. And I don't want to waste this $43, even though in college you're desperate for money. I went to an engraver in Fargo and I said, I have this story. I told him about it. And I said, how much would it cost to put this Indian prayer I came up with and a little note about the Old Crossing Treaty? So it's always a reminder for me. And by the way, I have that hanging in my house right now. And this engraver told me, he said, it cost $100. I didn't have $100, but the guy said, I'll do it for your treaty check. So that's how I spent my first treaty.
Thank you, Les. That's terrific. Well, okay, it's getting up late. Further, John, any final comments from you?
Yeah,
John.
yeah, not that it's that important to anybody, but I just say the Indian Claims Commission, for all of its faults, created a treasure trove of primary source material for scholars who came after the 1940s, like Les and I. And so if you ask me, where did you get a lot of your information? You know, to get that settlement, to get that claim, you know, this was a court proceeding, you know, with rules of evidence. You just couldn't come in and just make a claim and, oh, you know, it was part of our oral tradition or something else like that. That was not going to fly with an American sort of U.S. Court of Claims. Right? So they had to hire anthropologists, historians, lawyers, and other scholars to amass, you know, an evidentiary base to win their claim, which is what they did, and other tribes, many other tribes do. And for today, it's just sitting there in the National Archives in DC, and it is. I got a lot of my material for that. For that.
And we give thanks for people like John Shaw who have spent the time to do that. So thank you so much, John. Thank you for the rest of you. John, you will send us that 40-page document, and I'll pass that on to everybody in the thing. Okay, thank you again very much. Thank you all for being on. Thank you, Les. Thank you, Mike, and everybody else.
Thanks, John. Thanks, you, Les. John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you all.
Yeah, okay.